All right. So, what if you think that you should be interested in politics, either because you're interested in it or because you agree with Wallace that we should be involved in it? And you have tried voting, and there's something very, very bad going on that you can't just vote against and that you can't just let ride. And you've tried more engaged activism, and it is not working. And it is not an issue where you can tolerate your society being wrong about it forever. And you've tried nonviolent resistance, and it is not working. They just up their level of government violence and injustice. And remember, the original issue is not a tolerable one. And you might have even escalated to the point of low grade violence just to push back on the most obvious injustices that you can actually have maybe theoretically some effect on. And that's not working. They just double down on their violence to the degree that there's intolerable underlying issues that make the government not legitimate, so not really a government. And there's nothing that you can do anymore to reform that government. And moreover, this isn't just a private opinion of yours. This is actually a judgment held by enough people that there's a question about the legitimacy of the government even setting aside the original injustice. Well, then your main remaining option is, of course, to just let things proceed, but the other option is to overthrow the government, which is always an awkward suggestion because it seems extremely violent. And it is extremely violent. And also, the United States was created from specifically overthrowing a government. So our country literally came into being by way of a philosophical document justifying government and also on the exact same basis as the justification of government, justifying the overthrowing of a government by any means necessary under extreme circumstances, which the founding fathers thought that they were in the 1770s. So we're going to look through the Declaration of Independence here. So you can split the Declaration of Independence into four parts. There's the part that says, hi, this is a Declaration of Independence. There is a declaration of some philosophical principles that are supposed to justify that revolution. There is a description of the concrete specific situation that the colonists found themselves in that they thought made those principles applicable. And then there is the actual statement, okay, because of all that, we have declared independence and we are our own country. Now, the first and last part are just bookkeeping, and the third part is history. And that history is actually very complicated, right? So if you look at the different grievances that Jefferson and the colonists stated about the crown, there are three in there that are not credible, not creditable, right? So one of the issues was that the crown was encouraging enslaved people to liberate themselves. That is not a legitimate complaint. That the crown was not helping to commit ethnic cleansing against indigenous Americans, and that is again not a legitimate complaint. Historically speaking, the founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson, are profoundly compromised people, deeply hypocritical, and it is very challenging to our country and our history and our morality to pull apart the strands of, frankly, good and evil in that history. But what we're going to do right now is to focus strictly on the constructive part, strictly on the philosophical principles. Because even though the country has not abided by those principles, they're philosophically interesting in and of themselves. So our incredibly complicated history is very important. Everybody has to understand the good, the bad, their relationship, and all the rest of it. But right for this presentation, we are focusing only on the philosophical aspect of the Declaration of Independence. It is not permissible overall as a person or as a country to disregard all of that complicated history, but we are focusing on one aspect right now. It is frankly kind of popular in our present milieu to condemn the United States as nothing but a white supremacist nightmare, or to praise the United States as nothing but some kind of moral exemplar. Neither of those is a plausible reading of American history, which is simply complicated. This is about one aspect of that. It does not exclude the other aspects as being not interesting. It excludes them as being not exactly topical. Now, the philosophical part of the Declaration says that certain truths are self-evident. Self-evident does not mean obvious. Thomas Jefferson was trying to express, in a single long sentence, claims that had been developed over thousands of years of Western philosophy. And of course, has also been developed over thousands of years of a number of other philosophical traditions of equal worth and dignity that express themselves differently, but largely will be debates about the same underlying structures of government, the same conceptions of individual dignity, relationship between the individual and the government, and so forth. So there's nothing special here about the Western tradition. It's just that happens to be the language that Jefferson is going to employ. So when Jefferson says that these truths in the Declaration are self-evident, he doesn't mean anybody just knows them and that they're obvious. All of mathematics is self-evident in the sense that he's talking about, including calculus, right, which isn't self-evident in the sense of obvious. What he means by self-evident fits into a distinction between different ways in which we can know things. So customarily, people have sometimes thought that there are some facts that can be known only by a special divine revelation from God. So, for instance, it has often been held in the history of religion that anybody, anywhere, can prove that God exists, but you have to have a special location in time and place to know, what God said when he was sort of incarnated as the burning bush, or when he was speaking to Muhammad or something like that. You have to wait for the revelation to get those specific moral truths. And those are not then self-evident because not anybody could figure them out. Also, sometimes things are held to be something that you can only know because you're in a specific tradition. So someone might think that what Jefferson is writing here is just an expression of the fact that he's basically English. But when he says that these truths are self-evident, he's saying that they are not learned by a specific tradition, that they are knowable by anybody, anywhere, in principle. So they are knowable by reason, by any person who is capable of reflective thought and has any kind of remotely ordinary experience of human beings and all of the decisions that they make, the way that we cooperate, that we compromise, that we negotiate, that we discuss, that we divide labor, that we fight, and that we befriend one another. If you have any regular experience of that stuff and you are capable of reasoning about it, then you will be able to grasp these truths that are being held as self-evident. This remark is actually extremely important to the Declaration of Independence. This is what kind of self-consciously moves the Declaration of Independence from being some customs that some roughly English people in the northeastern part of the North American continent happened to hold just because they were raised in it, and some truths that were claimed to be something that anybody could figure out at any time in any place on the basis of individual human reason. This is not a throwaway phrase. That's actually part of the substance of the Declaration. The first of the self-evident truths is that all men are created equal, and we need to figure out what that means because depending on how you read it, it is obviously silly, right? People are different in a wide variety of ways, and some people are better at things and other people are worse at them. So the idea is that there are no what have been called natural kings or slaves. Now, a natural king or slave, the NAT in natural is the same NAT from natal. So a natural king is someone who is just born wiser than all the rest of us and more capable of managing our affairs for our good and for the common good than we are. And a natural slave would be someone who is just fitted by nature only for obedience, incapable of managing her own affairs without the guidance of some more competent person. And this, of course, is the agonizing hypocrisy of the Declaration of Independence, that as Jefferson was declaring that all men were created equal, he wasn't acting that way. We might be able to say that the progress of American history has been the progressive realization of what the meaning of the word all is. So we want to figure out what this equality is, given that, some people are cleverer and some people are more athletic and some people are good at math, and some people are very seductive and other people are not. I mean, we're obviously unequal in a huge number of ways. The equality is in our basic ability to manage our own lives better than anybody else could. I might not be the smartest person around, but there is no other person better fitted to manage my own personal life for my good or for the common good than I am. Right now, of course, we do have to acknowledge that there are people who are profoundly mentally ill, profoundly mentally handicapped, who do, in fact, need some sort of governance by other people. But Jefferson here is saying that the overwhelming majority of us do not need someone else to manage our affairs. We might benefit from advice from other people on occasions. Some of us who are bad at managing some of our affairs certainly should figure out who we can sort of rely on for guidance. But nobody is in general capable of making your life decisions better than you can. You have, of course, a very special perspective on your interests and what will constitute your well being that other people don't have. Even a person who is very thoughtful and genuinely trying to do the best for you does not know you from the inside out, does not fully understand how it is to exercise your particular gifts and abilities, doesn't understand the feelings of frustration when you are trying to take on a task that is simply not suited for you. So nobody else has that perspective, and moreover, nobody else has your sort of inherent motivation to pursue your well-being. You are naturally drawn to the kinds of things that will fulfill you. And of course, we're not always. Sometimes, we have unfortunate urges. But as a general rule, you are drawn sort of more or less to your own happiness. Other people are drawn to their happiness. It's not that they're drawn to your unhappiness, it's just that they don't have the sort of innate natural urge for your well being that you have. And there are exceptions like your parents and people like that. But overwhelmingly, other people are sort of best fit to be motivated to direct their own lives for their own good and thereby hopefully to the common good. And that applies to you too. That is the sense in which all men are said to be created equal. Now, we are said to be endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. Now, just as we are created equal and endowed by our Creator, the endowment here is just by way of existing. There's no such thing as a person who then is endowed with inalienable rights by a Creator who might have not endowed that person. It's just because you're a person, you're created as a person, that you have these rights. And it doesn't matter what the quote creator is. Jefferson himself did not believe in exactly the Judeo Christian deity. He did not think that any religion was particularly important in understanding morality. And bear in mind that these truths are supposed to be self evident. That means that you don't need to learn them from any special religious tradition or from any special divine revelation. So when we're talking here about a creator, we would use the word God for what he's talking about, but he's thinking more of the moral order of the universe or nature as such, not in any sense a supernatural person who is making laws and rules and regulations but could have made different ones. All right, so much for the endowment and the creation. So what are rights and what are unalienable ones? The most important first thing to realize about rights is that they do not exist. There is no such thing as a right. It is not an entity or object. We can say that a person has a right to something. And sometimes we can say that an animal might have a right to something, a corporation might have a right to something, that a people might have a right to something, even that a part of nature might have a right to something, but there are no such objects as rights. There are entities, chiefly people, that have rights to something. So to have a right to something is for it to be morally legitimate for you or some designee of yours to use force to ensure that you are actually able to do the thing that you have a right to do. So the concept of rights and the concept of violence are very closely connected.
but a right is not an object. That means you can't lose your rights, people can't take your rights, they can violate your rights, you can fail to exercise your rights, but you just have the rights that you have. Most rights are alienable. That is, you can alienate most of your rights from yourself. You can pass those rights on to someone else. I own my car, but what I really own is a right to drive my car, and I can sell that right. Bear in mind that the right to drive my car is not the ability to drive my car, because my car might break down, or moreover, somebody might steal it. They don't have a right to drive it at that point. I still have that right, but I don't have the ability to do so. Moreover, if that other person is driving my car, they have the ability to drive it, but they don't have the right to do so. All right, an inalienable right is one that you can't sell or exchange or give up for any purpose. The only way in which you could semi-alienate these rights are by committing crimes of various kinds. So it could be that you can alienate your right to life by committing murder, or maybe not. It could be that you can alienate your right to liberty by committing some kind of violent crime, or maybe not. Um, and maybe you can alienate your right to property again by some kind of crime, or maybe not. But you can't just sell them. You can't trade them for any consideration ever. So you cannot, and this is the important point, you cannot trade them to the government for protection. One of the views that Jefferson was responding to and saying was false was the idea that you more or less belong to the king because you trade your rights for his protection. And Jefferson's claim here is you cannot trade your rights. You cannot make yourself someone else's property, try as you might. You could even sign a contract alienating your freedom and say, okay, I will no longer make my own decisions. But the contract is not binding. So, what are these inalienable rights? Well, the list that Jefferson gives is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The more traditional list had been life, liberty, and property. So let's look at all four of those. The right to live is inalienable. I cannot contract to be killed. If I sign a contract according to which someone will kill me, and they don't, I cannot call the police and make them make the person kill me. That's just not a binding contract. All right, my right to make my own decisions, my right to liberty, is inalienable. I cannot contract to be a slave. If I were to sign a slavery contract, and then I decided that I was not interested in being a slave anymore, and I decided to make my own decisions and move somewhere else, you would have to find a deeply twisted and sick government before it would hunt me down and enforce the slavery contract. And yes, we have had such a sick government in our unfortunate parts of our history. My right to pursue happiness is my right to try to fulfill my conception of what my best life would be like. And this isn't, substantially different from the right to liberty. My right to possess property is inalienable, and that's the phrase as it had usually been made before the Declaration. Now, my right to any particular piece of property is alienable in that I can sell anything that I own, but I can't sell my right to own things. Right? I am not just some kind of spiritual choosing being. I am also a living, producing social being. And in order to be a living, producing social being, I need to be able to have material goods. I need food, clothing, shelter, healthcare, things like that. I have to be able to have these things. Now, that's not to say that somebody necessarily owes those particular things to me, but they can't make it so that I don't have any of them. So you might happen to be propertyless, and that might be not really my problem, but I can't render you propertyless. I can't steal from you. Moreover, in messing with your property, I'm messing with your plans that involved that property. So I'm interfering with your liberty and possibly even your life. Now, mind you, Thomas Jefferson and also Thomas Paine, whom we'll be glancing at in a second, did advocate pushing toward relative economic equality through high inheritance taxes and other kinds of redistribution of wealth. although Jefferson was very intermittent about this. So the right to property wasn't understood to be the right to just acquire things without limit. It was the right to own the things that you had earned and that you were sort of using in your plans. And all of this really amounts to an ethics of violence. The theory has it that you may use violence, but only to ensure that you're not interfered with in your living and choosing. It certainly doesn't counsel violence, it only authorizes it. And as a practical matter, we should use violence only if the harm to be done to us is severe or repeated. So don't just say that violence is your last resort. You need to actually try everything else before resorting to it. But those are the rights that we are said to have. Jefferson continues that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And what that means is the government is not natural. We create governments, they are instituted. So, to have a right to do something is for it to be morally legitimate to use force to secure your ability to do it. But it's extremely problematic for everyone to be deciding whose actions violate whose rights and use force on their own behalves. We tend to exaggerate the harms done to us. We tend to not adequately understand the harms that we do to other people. So there will be feuds and all kinds of chaos and randomness. Moreover, a lot of our rights are actually quite complicated. Your rights to various pieces of property are very complicated contractual matters, and it's easy for people, even well-intended people, to have disagreements about what rights that they have. So we create governments to help us adjudicate these disputes in the most peaceful ways possible. The point of a government is actually largely to act on behalf of the self-described victim of a crime, but in a very limited way. So the purpose of a government is as much, or at least as much, to protect the accused from the accuser as it is to protect people who will end up later making an accusation. There are kind of societies that seem to be pretty natural. A family seems to sort of naturally emerge, right? People have sexual attractions to one another, they make babies, and you don't really need to plan that kind of stuff out in advance. Even villages, if people are kind of closely related, they all know one another. They don't. Those aren't institutions. They are groupings of people that can be sort of custom bound and personal and friendship bound. But when you get very much more complicated than that, we need some neutral third party to help us resolve our disputes, and we have to create it intentionally. And we have to endow it with the powers that we want it to exercise by way of some kind of agreement among one another. So governments are instituted, they do not grow naturally. What legitimates a government, what turns it into an actual government as opposed to just a bunch of powerful people, is it enjoys the support of at least a plurality of its citizens. That is, there are more people who want this government than want any other particular alternative. And it ensures and does not violate the rights of its citizens, and of course also other citizens. I mean, my government is not necessarily here to ensure the rights of non-citizens, but it certainly doesn't get to violate the rights of non-citizens. A popular but unjust government is not fully legitimate. A just but unpopular government is not fully legitimate. And unfortunately, if you have injustice be popular enough, you simply cannot have a legitimate government, right? So if a plurality of the people want injustice, you can't have a legitimate government, and that is a very awkward situation for a society to find itself in. Now, this is the point where Thomas Paine fits in. Thomas Paine gives a description of how a government might be formed. So he says, there are these natural growths, families and maybe even villages. So families will produce and consume amongst themselves. They can compromise, negotiate, and then there's sort of supposed to be a natural hierarchy that, of course, we nowadays think is kind of silly. Then families will find it advantageous to sort of focus on different kinds of production so that they can barter with other families. And eventually you're going to have enough of a complicated arrangement of barters that it becomes advantageous to introduce money. And then the money printing, the money storing, the money handling institution has sort of become a city government. And that is the point at which the society becomes partly an artifact of whoever it is that is making money and sort of enforcing rules about it. A city, in that sense, of a very stunted form, can exist as just a glob of like currency-like stuff floating around, or competing banks or something. It needs tending, it needs statesmanship to be perfected. So it's natural in the sense that it emerges crudely and approximately from something entirely spontaneous, but it is not natural in the sense that it tends to its own perfection, so it needs to be instituted. Moreover, individuals find it advantageous to contract with each other for a third party to adjudicate their disputes and to protect them outside of emergencies. So government really is artificial. You can have kind of clusters of people who are sort of vaguely in agreement with one another about stuff, but when they create an actual government, they have created it. It has not just come about by chance. Anything that just grows and is never agreed to, or more or less kind of explicitly consented to by the people that it governs, is not actually a government. It might be kind of acting like a government might, but it's still not a government unless it is instituted and consented to. Jefferson concludes that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles, and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So remember what we've learned from thinking about anarchism, whether you're an anarchist or not. Governments are inherently legitimate. So an illegitimate government isn't a government, right? So just as counterfeit currency is not a kind of currency, an illegitimate government is not a kind of government. You have no reason to obey an illegitimate government other than fear of punishment. You might think that there are no legitimate governments, but certainly an illegitimate government is not something that you have any reason of state to obey. You may use any means necessary to liberate yourself from an illegitimate so-called government, in just the same way that you may use any means necessary to protect yourself from anyone else who seeks to violate your rights. But now bear in mind, the people is what establishes government, and the people have the right to alter or abolish it. So individual resistance to a government might be part of a revolution, or it might be the start of a revolution, and it certainly can be an act of integrity when it is well justified. But revolution is not a matter of an individual preference. If you feel like your government is hurting you, that doesn't imply that it is. This isn't a matter of whim, and it is not subjective. A government has to actually be unjust, and a revolution has to enjoy some meaningful support before overthrowing that government is legitimate. And if you feel that this is only history, it was also only history right before it was written in 1776, because the colonists were looking to the example of the Glorious Revolution of 1688 in England, which had been done on a similar basis. So the fact that it's history now does not imply that it isn't also morality now and forever.